What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. I just spent 7 hours playing post-patch Marvel Snap. Here are my top decks for you to play on day 1 of this new meta. I never thought I would start a video with an Agatha deck. I just never thought this day would come. But Agatha's change to only control the even turns has allowed for what I like to call Agatha, but I'm going to do my due diligence here and give deference to the player who created it, Husky Puppies, who got as high as rank 3 as far as I know with this deck. What this deck is attempting to do is use Moon Knight and Lady Sif to discard Agatha, and then play something similar to the old Goon Knight game plan of just a bunch of really powerful 5s, when in addition you also have the ability to get a gigantic Ebony Blade off of the Agatha, and a Ghost Rider to bring her back and put her on the board again. This deck genuinely does leverage Agatha's sort of hidden advantage, which is, since she doesn't start in your deck, she starts in your hand, you effectively have a thinner deck. And that allows you to pull off what this deck is trying to do with surprising alacrity. This is a deck that does what it does more than you think, because you effectively have 8 cards in your deck on turn 1 instead of 9 because Agatha's in your hand. You're just more likely to do things like Ebony Maw into Lady Sif because of how that works. Now, that's not to say that you are 100% reliant on getting some good Agatha stuff off. It is very good when you can get it done, but you are also able to do things like Wave into Agatha, and then that's just 14 power, and then you spend the rest of your time playing, let's say you play a Black Bolt on turn 5 into a Stature and a Claw. Very hard for your opponents to actually beat. The basic premise here is you want to do your Agatha on turn 4, get that out there, Black Bolt on 5, remove some of your opponent's ability to interact with you, and then on 6, play 5+1, where that 1 is a Stature. That's kind of the nut draw here. Now, this deck does have some legitimate vulnerabilities in the case of things like Shadow King and Shang-Chi, depending on how exactly you're getting your big points out on turn 4. Shadow King works against the Ebony Blade, Shang-Chi works when you are bringing back with a Ghost Rider. That kind of stuff is dangerous, but make no mistake, there are just kind of a lot of points in this deck. This is a deck that I think a lot of people will look at and feel disrespected playing against, and I can say this because that's how I felt. I felt whenever I played this deck, there's no real way I'm losing to Agatha right now, is there? But you can, and you will, and you need to respect this deck and treat it seriously. This is a legitimate threat. It's a good deck that does a lot of powerful stuff that is exceptionally good in the current metagame. The reason for this is because one of the things that's really stuck out to me about post-patch meta is just how not up to par traditional Wiccan decks feel. These typical decks that are playing like 1-drops, 2-drops, 3-drops, 4-drops, and like 2 6-drops just don't have enough power in them to be able to face up to something like this. They're not going to beat a turn 4 Agatha. They don't have a way of dealing with any of that. They're just not able to output enough points. And so that is a matchup that is actively good for this deck into what was a dominant deck. There are so many decks that are just not packing answers to just, here's a really big guy backed up by some disruption in the form of Goon Knight and Black Bolt, and then you just end up in a situation where this deck is putting out more points and disrupting you meaningfully, and you stay because you're arrogant and you're like, how could I possibly lose to Agatha? And then you lose to like what their incredibly diverse turn 6 can be, whether that be a Claw and a Stature or what have you. It's very hard to predict what they're actually going to do, and they're very easily able to get ahead and actually access this kind of power. I think this might be the new Goon Knight, if that makes sense. This is a deck that just does what it does, and it does it well. A very powerful, very straightforward, explosive points deck that has enough disruption to keep you in the game. I can tell you that playing against this made me feel like I wanted more Shadow Kings and more Shang-Chis in so many different things, and just way less Alioth reliance. In line with that, I immediately, after seeing the direction things seemed to be going, what I decided to do was just play a deck with Shadow King and Shang-Chi in it and just be like, look, I'm not losing to this crap. There are a lot of people who are excited to play Agatha, and my job at this point was just like, I don't want to lose to this crap anymore. I am sick of it. I refuse to get got by all of this stuff, and yeah, it pretty much worked. Like, if you are wondering what you want to do to beat the Agatha deck, you have to understand that's like, all right, we need to go back to the way things used to be. We need to be able to interact with what our opponents are doing. Shadow King and Shang-Chi are coming out of retirement. And I really can't stress this enough. It was very difficult for me to get anywhere with a traditional Wiccan deck. I tried the traditional Wiccan deck. I tried putting the Storm combo in there with War Machine and Legion. I tried a bunch of stuff, but ultimately the conclusion I came to was just, there's not enough points in that deck to keep up with a lot of what's happening right now. And because of that, I ended up in a different sort of situation. I wanted to be a Shadow King Shang-Chi deck that was able to output points, but wasn't giving up a ton if people were still playing those Wiccan decks. Because just because I think that it's not necessarily the greatest time to play those decks right now, doesn't mean that they're not going to be around. And so Bounce was a great sort of equalizer for that, balancing the two things that I wanted to do. It is able to get a lot of points on the board, it is able to access a lot of power, and it's also able to not be immediately dead to the card Goliath all of the time. Not that you're not dead to it some of the time, but you are able to be a deck that does things like clog up your opponent some of the time, and have a big werewolf, and win lanes that are not vulnerable to Goliath, and that I think is like a crucial part of why I like this deck, because it manages to be a good points deck with some clog ability in it, and of course, the ability to interact with anyone who is willing to disrespect the existence of Shang-Chi and Shadow King, which is a lot of people right now. Just a solid, very high skill cap, but extremely strong deck, in my opinion. I know I said I wasn't a fan of Wiccan decks, and that's because I basically had to go back to the drawing board on the entire concept of the deck. Every Wiccan deck has been built in sort of the same way. In that way, it relies far more on cards like Goliath or Lady Deathstrike than it does on Shang-Chi's and Shadow Kings, and right now we're sort of experiencing the backlash of that. The decks that are able to beat the crap out of that kind of stuff, that Agatha deck, the Tens deck, these are decks that are just able to put out way too much points. Just the massive amounts of points that you won't be able to interact with your Goliath or whatever, because you simply don't have the amount of points in your deck necessary for that to actually make sense. So what does it take to be a deck that is able to play Shang-Chi in a Wiccan shell? I think it might take the Grandmaster. I realize that's also ridiculous, but again, this is the kind of play line that's just like absolutely unbeatable for any of those decks. They're just like, hey, I'm just making some big guys and disrespecting Shang-Chi. You are going to lose to like Grandmaster Shang-Chi. I was able to actually do that multiple times with this deck. The other thing that this deck has is just a really deep bag of tricks. There's Hazmat Ajax. There's Grandmastering a Sage. There's Symbiote Spider-Manning a Sage. There's moving stuff around with Madam Web so that you can create the perfect lane for you to Symbiote Spider-Man. There's saging the Madam Web lane, moving the Sage out, playing Symbiote Spider-Man, and then doing the Sage again on a different lane because of how that stuff works. And all of these sort of tricks go together. Madam Web here is basically to clear the way for our powerful Grandmaster combos, but like some of the time, if I'm gonna be completely honest, some of the time I'm just like playing Grandmaster on Silver Sable. And that's not even that bad either though, because Symbiote Spider-Man can then merge with the Grandmaster. And so you end up in with a deck that has just this very, 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 very deep bag of tricks. It can throw everything at its opponents. It's very difficult for it to actually be predicted, because you have this ability to move stuff around, have extra on reveals, get more power out there, and fundamentally you're also just playing a lot of big, beefy boys and girls. Sage is very large, Speed is very large, Wiccan's a pretty decently sized dude, but Ajax is really where you get that beef back. Between Ajax, Sage, and Symbiote Spider-Man Sage, you are actually able to meaningfully compete with pretty much any deck that is trying to like outpoint typical versions of the Wiccan deck, because A, you have this stuff you can win even without a Shang, and B, you have a Shang, so you can be a Shang deck too. I'm going to be honest, I did not expect much out of this archetype. I didn't expect it to be good. I didn't expect it to stick around. But I gotta tell you, it kind of is. And I was as surprised as anybody, right? You know me, I'm the package guy. I don't want to be playing a deck that's fully dedicated to this kind of stuff. Why would I be playing? I actually yelled at my chat about this. Like, why would I play bad cards so that I could make my other bad cards better? But I gotta tell you, when I played against this stuff, it was actually legitimately kind of scary. There were some real power plays that this deck could do. And I don't know if this is the best build of it, but this is my way of saying, like, hey, there might actually be something here. There are a bunch of different ways to approach what this kind of thing can do. I can tell you that when I tried to fuse the combo into Wiccan stuff, that didn't work, but I think that might be more a reflection on Wiccan stuff than the combo here. And because there's not a good mid-range deck for this kind of stuff to fuse into, maybe if you want to utilize it, you actually just have to lean in. The big weakness that this deck has is that there are a bunch of people playing exactly this. So if you're trying to go for your Storm combo, I mean, you better hope they don't have a War Machine too. You better hope they don't have a Legion too, because you're going to get blown out if they do, because you're the one who actually played Storm. And I think that bothered me a lot when I was playing this, because it was like, okay, I can't really get a huge sense of what's good and what's bad because so many people are playing things that are in this deck that are good against this deck because they're also doing this, and it doesn't really give me a sense of how good this deck can be in a world where those mirrors are not nearly as common because it's not day one and people aren't all playing the War Machine stuff because they're trying to figure out what to do. I think that there could be something here. I do not know for a fact that there is something here, but I think there very reasonably could be something here. I was surprised at the power this deck could output. I was surprised at how strong leaning into the Infinite and Ebony Maw were. I didn't expect any of that stuff to be good, and this is my mea culpa. I think that there is something worth investigating here. I don't know how long it will last, but there is something to be said for a deck that like 1 in 10 times is just going to instantly win the game. There is something to be said for that. Now, that said, there's a little bit too much counterplay to this right now, so it's not actually instantly winning the game. That's the number one issue I think this deck may have. Once people sort of forget about this, I think this could actually show up and be a deck you can climb with. One of the things that seems to happen early in metagames is before they're actually formed, Zoo is just a perfectly good deck, and that is happening again right now, where it's just like, this is a deck that can output a ton of points, can match up into basically anything, and if things go right for you, you're gonna dominate everyone. One of the issues that I felt, though, is that when the Agatha deck really goes off, you actually sort of have this deck where it's like, if something bad happens to you, like you get a bad roll on a Shauna, or you have a hand that doesn't allow you to actually execute your game plan well, you like have to skip a turn or something, or fill up a lane too early, or there's a bad location that their Legion can really exacerbate for you. Like, this is a deck that is a little fragile, honestly. It has a ton of power, a lot of output, but it is fragile. And there is a legitimate worry about being a fragile deck right now because you can just fall apart and lose these matchups that honestly are usually pretty good. And so you end up with a very powerful but very fragile deck because not only did we end up getting Shadow King in here in lieu of Kyera, making us more vulnerable to Killmonger, it's also the kind of deck that can just lose to itself. I can't tell you how many, I can actually tell you. I got Ebony Maw twice off of this lady, and I got Martyr twice as well. Like, I got a Blade that discarded my Khazar, which is what I needed to make my Gilgamesh stronger. Just awful all around. Like, just, Shauna really abused me while I was playing this deck. If you have slightly better luck than me, maybe you'll be able to climb a lot more than I was. But really, all seriousness, like, if you are not getting the literal worst one-drops in the game off of Shauna, then this deck has every tool you need. It really does. It has a ton of points, enough interaction in the form of Shadow King that you can just sort of beat things that are relying on Shadow King-able targets, and just generally, you are almost always going to be able to take every game to a 50-50 because of how big Gilgamesh can get. There's just kind of a lot of one-drops running around right now, and that means that it might be a good time to play Destroy. By a similar token, because there are so many one-drops running around, Destroy ends up pretty okay, But there's also this thing where it's like, this is a metagame where you can actually just put out a lot of points and be okay, right? Like a destroy nut draw matching up into the Agatha deck is legitimately the kind of thing that's very hard for them to beat. A destroy nut draw matching up into like the Wiccan deck if they don't have a Lyeth, and if you're able to get a death down, that kind of stuff is hard for them to beat because most people aren't me. They're not they're not like putting this huge premium on Shadow King and Shang-Chi just yet. And so Destroy ends up being a deck where it's like, okay, Killmonger just gets free targets, right? People are playing moves so you get to blow up a Human Torch. People are playing Ebony Maw in their War Machine decks, you get to blow that up. The Wiccan decks are playing 3 1-drops or 4 1-drops. You get the targets off of the Kate Bishop arrows. You just get a bunch of easy little procs that can really make Death a really powerful card in the current metagame. And so that allows you to have a little bit more leeway. Like, it's almost like Marvel Snap is getting, I don't know, simpler. And that allows a deck like this that can just nut draw the crap out of people to actually be just very, 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 very good. Like, if you are able to get your nut draw, you can snap it against most decks. Like, when you're sitting there looking at, like, a Deadpool into a Hulkbuster, and you start blowing that guy up, you are good to go. That is just a ton of points. You can even, if you really want to be more of an even field with these other Shang-Chi decks, you can take the Arnim Zola out and put a Shang-Chi in. Like, you can be whatever it is you want to be in this deck. And right now, I think that, as weird as it may sound, like, there's just some really good reasons to want to be a Destroy gamer right now. I really can't explain it. I can't. But I think a lot of it is that in early metagames, other people are experimenting with archetypes, right? And one of the reasons Zoo is so consistently good is because you already know what the best build is. And Destroy benefits from this hugely as well. Like, you are in a new metagame. A bunch of people are going to be messing around with stuff that we don't even know if it's good or not. We don't know for sure if the Agatha stuff is good. I think it is. We don't know for sure if the Infinite stuff is good. I think it is, but we'll see. And we do know that this deck can, at baseline, perform relatively well into whatever. Killmonger is a good card right now, and so you get a lot of equity just by having a deck that isn't kind of a question mark. You know that you're playing damn near the best build of the deck that you possibly can, and that matters. I wanted to show you a couple of other things I was messing around with. These are decks that I genuinely am not sure I would recommend, but I want to put on here just because A, I played them, and B, I wanted to see if they got anyone's brain whirring a little bit. These are both attempts at hybridizing the Storm stuff into otherwise good cards shells. And I think maybe, like, I can't tell exactly if the issue is, oh, we can't hybridize the Storm stuff into this because it's bad, or, oh, we can't hybridize the Storm stuff into this because the shells I'm trying to hybridize with are bad. And so that's what I wanted to talk about with these last two decks. This is an attempt at basically hybridizing it with Sandman. Like, this is a Sandman deck, but instead of Sandman, you're doing this other stuff, right? That's what's actually happening here. I was not able to get this very far off the ground because I kept running into people who were just doing things like this, but bigger. Like, if you run into someone who is playing Ebony Maw and Infinite, being the small ball version of this kind of strategy is not good. You end up getting kind of run the hell over because they're also playing War Machine, and that makes everything suck. You're trying to small ball it out, and they're just like, dude, that is not a good strategy right now. Again, this is the kind of thing where it's like very dependent on what your opponents are running. This is a thing that's like, maybe we come back to this in a bit when there are less people doing this War Machine stuff and it ends up being actually good. I don't know. But I did want to highlight, hey, take the old Sandman shell, try it out. I'm sure people will have this idea. Did not go well for me. By far my biggest loser of the day was this, though. And it is the deck that sort of led me to the realization about Wiccan decks. And I realize people can look at this and be like, Cam, you weren't playing a real Wiccan deck. Come on now, you were playing some bad cards in the Wiccan thing. But every time I played a Wiccan deck, I simply felt like I just didn't have enough points. And yes, this deck exacerbates that by playing a 5/7, a 4/7, and a Storm, right? I get that. You have even less points than normal. But the point that I'm trying to drive at right now is this is a deck that needs to have a baseline level of points if it wants to compete, literally with an Agatha deck. And I want you to sit there and think about that sentence for a while, because Playing decks like this is what drove me to Tricci Wicci. It's what drove me to like, dude, I have to be one of these decks that can play a Shang-Chi, because otherwise I don't think I have enough points to compete with the Scar deck, with the Agatha deck. I just don't have enough numbers. And this deck, fundamentally, it just does. You will literally lose to the Agatha deck. Like, I cannot stress this enough. You will die to Agatha Harkness. You will feel stupid when you play a Wiccan deck and you run into one of those decks and it draws well. You will feel bad. And I am as surprised by that realization as anybody, but I think that we have to respect that, and that means adapting away from what Wiccan decks have been in the past. This relatively low power, high impact big guys thing. I mean, when your opponent is playing a Ghost Rider into an Agatha that's 18 power on turn 4, I don't know what you're supposed to do about it. You kind of just lose. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed that look at my top 7 day 1 decks for this new metagame. I think that there is just a ton to figure out. Like, we are in a brave new world right now, and I have no idea how things shape up. I'm really excited to see what happens. I'm overjoyed that something like Agatha can be good, and huge shout out to my boy Husky Puppies for pulling that off. That's just so cool to see him cook that list up. So dope. As always, I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. I hope you enjoy, and I will see you in the next one.